Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Where we will be turning our attention today to various coronavirus-related issues, but perhaps, and I don't know how emblematic this is of a bigger truth or a broader problem, perhaps not focusing upon the most important question of all, which is how confident are we that we're actually coming out of it? I don't know about you. I don't want to have that conversation. I know we should. I know it's a little bit childish or simplistic, but it's almost as if you can just pretend that mountain isn't there, then you don't have to go to the trouble of trying to climb it. And everybody, fingers crossed, pray to whatever God you believe in, whatever it may be, throw pennies in the wishing well, and just hope that we're all right, and hope that more by luck than judgment, we do actually head towards a return to a semblance of normality without having a so-called second spike. The economic news today is absolutely devastating, but I don't think at this point in proceedings you can actually blame anybody for it. The blame game, such as it is, or rather the desire to see the people running the country bear some responsibility for the way in which they've run the country, it's probably a better way of putting it than blame game, isn't it? Will hinge upon the question of how much economic damage could have been avoided by a better managed strategy, in the same way that we are already wondering how many people would still be alive if we'd had better leadership and, of course, a different Prime Minister. So let's turn our attention to things that we can actually analyse and discuss without needing to wait for a little more dust to settle. So today I'm really worried about schools. And the problem that we've got now is that Boris Johnson announces a £1 billion package to help pupils in England. But, you know, it's not long ago he announced a world-beating app that would enable us to test and trace infected people in a way that minimised the likelihood of another spread. What else has he announced lately? He's announced that we've got loads of PPE. He's announced that we were world-beating in our handling of this. He's announced all sorts of things, and I don't think any of them have really come to fruition in the way that he promised. So I hope that they can find £1 billion to help pupils in England to catch up on lost learning. But here's the problem, and I may invite some help from teachers with this a little later in the programme. My fear will be that the benefits of any increased investment in education will be confined to the usual suspects. They'll be confined to, you know, the middle-class parents who care deeply about their children's education. You don't have to be middle-class for that. I just mean the sharp-elbowed, if you like, the people who, and I have no criticism of them whatsoever. I just have to acknowledge that their actions have consequences for other people as well. You push to the front of the queue because you want your children to get whatever is best and whatever is available, but that's a queue, and it means that there'll be some people behind your children, and those children, it seems to me, are very likely to be the children who are actually most in need of the sort of help that the government is at least flirting with the idea of providing. But we'll get onto that a little later in the programme. Staying with children, I don't know if you heard Nick discussing that story about children sending nude pictures of themselves to each other, and astonishing statistics that will strike a chill into the heart of any parent of children aged roughly the age of mine. I'm keen to talk about that from a voyage of discovery perspective, and so we may confine the conversation to people who've done it and now have grown up a little bit, people who are a little older, and indeed to parents who've discovered to their own shock and horror that their little treasures have indulged in precisely this sort of behaviour. But we'll start with the app, OK? A smartphone app to track the spread of COVID-19 may never be released, ministers admitted yesterday, as they abandoned a 3-month attempt to create their own version of the technology. Now, I watched Matt Hancock yesterday. He's looking even more haunted than usual, isn't he? And oddly enough, he looked quite haunted at the beginning, as if he almost had a fear or a suspicion of what might happen to him after he sold his soul to Boris Johnson late last year. I watched the press conference yesterday and I had a bit of a moment. I'm not going to lie to you. I had a bit of a sort of double take, you know, a Scooby-Doo, one of those little moments, because I don't remember anybody mentioning that we were actually pursuing both apps all along, and that there was a sort of attempt to set one off against the other, wasn't there? I'm pretty sure callers told us on this programme weeks ago that the app that the government was looking at wouldn't work on Apple phones. Wasn't that one of the first things, or have I imagined that? That's the problem now, is that I feel I am just dipping under the surface of having my head on right. Do you know what I mean? Just beginning, not to drown, but just beginning to struggle to swim. I like, as you do as well, because you choose to listen to this programme, I like to know what's going on. I don't like comforting lies or empty slogans. They don't work on me. There are times, particularly with Brexit looming, that I really wish I did. I wish I could find comfort in things that are simply not true, but which spare me the strain of having to think about them. But with this app, I think for the first time this morning, I found myself almost waving the white flag. The complications, the confusions, the contradictions, the misdirections, the misinformation, the outright lies, the deceits, the deceptions, just now are reaching a point of critical mass where I find myself thinking, and I'm about to ask you to help me get back on the straight and narrow, to mix my metaphors quite violently. I find myself thinking now that, oh, for heaven's sake, I just can't keep up anymore. I thought we needed an app before we could properly loosen the lockdown. I thought we needed a really top-class testing and tracing system before we could even contemplate reopening shops. And as far as I can tell, we haven't got one. And the last person I'd trust to tell me that we have got one is the person who's currently in charge of trying to reassure the country that we're safe. Am I making sense to you when I say, I'm using the swimming analogy? The swimming analogy works quite well for me. It's only 10 minutes past 10. I reserve the right to change it completely by 11 o'clock. But I've been swimming quite happily. I've been, even tried a bit of butterfly, bit of backstroke, bit of breaststroke over there. It's the PPE, got my head around the PPE. That was all nonsense. The reason why we didn't do the testing was because we didn't have the kit. The reason why we didn't have the PPE was because we hadn't done the preparedness. The reason why we didn't have the equipment was because we hadn't got the stockpile. The reason why we didn't have a strategy was because Boris Johnson shut down the committee dedicated to pandemic response within days of becoming Prime Minister. The reason why we didn't have any leadership was because he went on holiday in February. Do you see what I mean? I can swim around. I've got it. Touch that base there, swim down, inflate my pyjamas, swim to the other side, dive underneath the water, get the leather brick, bring it back up again, pop it on the side, green badge, yellow badge, red badge, blue badge. I've been doing great. I've had my head around everything. And then today, looking at this story about the app, I just feel myself throwing my hands up in frustration and saying, I don't even know what day it is anymore. Friday, yeah. I don't even know what day it is anymore. I'm 99% sure that we were supposed to have a really good testing and tracing system in place before we could even contemplate reopening some of the stuff that we've reopened this week. And yet then I hear people who, to the best of my knowledge, don't have any doctorates in virology, insisting that we need to get even more open as quickly as possible, otherwise, terrible things will happen. We've got to get the schools reopened, but the children don't feel safe. Doesn't matter, send them over the top. They're lucky we're not sending them up chimneys. They're only running the risk of getting a coronavirus. They don't know they're born, these youngsters, the youth of today. Don't know how lucky they're. Send them back to school. Screw the social distance. Do you see what I mean? Everything's gone a little bit mad, at least from where I'm sitting. You know what happens next. What does it look like from where you're sitting? Let's get these phone lines open. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Would you like to have a go at talking the rest of us through what has happened, what is happening, and what should happen with regard to the testing and tracing app? Because, I've sat in front of this microphone now for the best part of 3 months, is it? April, May, yeah, not far off. And at the very, very beginning, when we talked about countries like South Korea, we were acknowledging the absolute crucial importance of an app to handle testing and tracing. We spoke to former directors of public health, like Professor John Ashton, former chief scientific advisors, I think, like David Green, who referenced the necessity of this. And I watched that press conference yesterday, and this is the thought that began to form in my mind, okay? And this is where I would like you to get started this morning. This is the thought that began to form in my mind. I don't know, as is constantly the case at the moment, whether it is deliberate or whether it is just a consequence of weapons-grade incompetence. But as I watched Matt Hancock talk, I think for the first time, about the questionable notion that they'd been pursuing both apps all along and had now decided to plump with the one they've never mentioned the prospect of plumping for, and they've abandoned the one they insisted was world-beating and would lead us out of this mess into a glorious new dawn. It could just be an omission, or it could be that I missed the press conference where he said, no, we're pursuing both, we'll pick the best one at a later date. And I dreamt all the talk about it being world-beating and the cherry on the icing of the cake and the necessary prerequisite for any loosening of the law. It's perfectly possible I dreamt all that. And they've been telling us all along it was 2 for 2. But I watched that press conference yesterday, and you don't need to have watched it to contribute to the conversation today. I watched that press conference yesterday, and I thought, this is where my head starts just dipping below the waterline, because they're just, contradicting what they said a week ago, specifically on the question of the testing and tracing, the app. Have I gone mad? Or was it, at some point, not that long ago, really, really important that we got it right before we contemplated the next stage? Have I gone mad, or and I don't mean to sound as if I'm in any way denigrating people who ring into radio phone-in programmes. That would be a proper Jared Ratner moment, wouldn't it? But I don't expect to get calls from people 2 months ago describing the inadequacies that Matt Hancock apparently only woke up to yesterday. Boris Johnson was in the House of Commons a matter of days ago, talking up this app and guaranteeing it. How long since he said it would be in place by the beginning of June? Narrator, it is now June the 19th. Do you see what I mean? I hesitate to say this because it's my job, and I know that some of you are foolish enough to rely upon me for plotting a clear path through these muddy waters, but they're now so muddy. Have we gone a bit Trump now, do you think? Are we just all going to choose to believe whatever we want to believe, regardless of what's actually in front of our eyes and the government has actually done? Or can you talk us through the app, the testing, the tracing, in a way that will at least allow a little bit of clarity into proceedings? It's 10:15. The phone lines are open. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. And before we head to the break, remember I told you at the top of the show yesterday that there was footage of me swapping jokes with the legend that is Bob Holness behind Dame Vera Lynn and near Dame Baroness Margaret Thatcher at Dame Vera's 80th birthday party. We've only gone and found the footage, haven't we? Let joy be unconfined. And I've done it again, haven't I? It's all very well doing my lengthy, indeed, sometimes labyrinthine introduction, but you could probably have boiled it all down to, what the flip is going on, lads? Seriously. I thought we needed an app before we could loosen the lockdown, and now everyone's pretending... Well, enough from me. John's in Bounds Green. John, what's going on?
Hi, mate. I love the show, mate. First-time caller.
Welcome.
I just thought I might be able to add just one little chunk of information to this business about the app. Long time back, probably late March, early April, I went on a webinar which was discussing another app. This is the COVID-19 symptom reporting app,
right?
Which has been around for a long time. It's run by a guy called Professor Tim Spector from
cool name.
King's College London.
I've heard of him. Yes.
Yeah.
Carry on.
And he basically there was discussion about funding. Everybody else is funding that app, which is very useful because it gives you early warning of what's kind of happening. It gives you information about what's happening with the disease in the country, which a lot of other epidemiologists have been describing as a black hole.
Yes.
Scottish government supports it, Welsh government supports it, most of the Royal Medical Colleges support it. NHS England, not supporting it. The professor was asked why not. He gave his opinion. He said, I guess it's because they don't want another app competing with their app, which is in development. And I just think, putting two and two together and making five maybe, that they did not want any other app, even though they're actually quite distinct, to take the shine off of their app, which was supposed to sort of take...
I'll tell you what, John, I thought I was confused before you started talking. I've got apps coming out of parts of me I haven't even acknowledged since lockdown began. So that makes some sense, because we are talking about human incompetence a lot of the time when we're examining the reasons why the science hasn't been properly applied. But this app wouldn't do what the other app did. It doesn't actually address the same problems as the testing and tracing app. But there is a sense, if I could possibly try to distill down what you've said, there's a very real sense that they don't think they kind of need to own it all. Is that what you're saying? Downing Street in
Absolutely that.
particular,
They
the
need to own
English
it all.
government, they're not interested in... I mean, isn't there a Europe-wide one as well that we've opted out of? Is that the same one that you're talking about?
No, I think that's another tracking and tracing app. The French have got an app up, I believe.
So this is
Google Apple model.
This is the vote leave government, isn't it? Thinking, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, that they're possessed of some super skills and superpowers that the rest of the planet can only dream of possessing. And you know, okay, everything has gone wrong so far, but any minute now, the superpowers and the super skills, Dominic Cummings is going to step into a phone box and step out again with his pants on the outside of his trousers. Super Dom.
And yes, surprise, surprise, it hasn't happened.
No.
Now, you see, this really surprises me because I thought, I mean, I've got no time for Boris Johnson.
No.
Can't bear the man. But I thought that what he would do, I thought he'd go all World War II on us, James. I thought he would be
he
like...
went on holiday, John.
He went the talents of all the countries.
He went on holiday.
You know?
He went on holiday.
You know, exactly. And he didn't do that. He didn't, you know...
But we
I
digress.
know personally people who build apps...
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, how come you were in on this webinar? But, I mean, clearly you're qualified in this field to a degree that I'm not. What's the current...
I'm not particularly qualified in apps. I'm quite techie. You know,
but what's your current understanding of the situation then? I thought that you needed to have absolutely first-class testing and tracing, whether or not it involved an app. It had to be absolutely Premier League before you could contemplate loosening the lockdown. But we've loosened the lockdown. Yeah. I mean, the lockdown fell apart on the day of the Barnard Castle eye test. I think everybody knows that. What was left of it anyway fell apart that day. What's the score today? What's your understanding of testing and tracing? Because I just heard an advertisement for it on this programme, and I understand what the advertisement said. But if I'm in the studio today, so I have probably come into contact unwittingly with more people in the last hour than I have in the last month. How do I know if one of them gets it? Who's going to tell me?
Exactly. You don't have to be I'm a techie person. You don't need to be a techie person to understand that manual contact tracing, can ring you up and say, who have you been in contact with? But it can't tell you who you were stuck next to for half an hour on the tube. I don't
know his name. There was a big lad. There's a big fella, pale blue shirt. Looks like he's cut his own hair.
What's that?
Oh, sorry. Theo Ushwood just came into the studio. John, you mind how you go? 24 minutes after the 10 is the time. So, you've had it. If you got it now, and we had passed in the corridor earlier, and I didn't know who you were, who would get in touch with me to tell me?
Nobody. So the way it works is that if I had it and I tested positive for it,
yes,
I would then get an email to say to go onto the website and fill in details of people I've been in contact with, and if I knew you, but then I would push in your details, and then somebody from the track and trace service would ring you up.
I'm quite a bad example because I'm so famous, but it is conceivable that you could pass someone in the corridor in this very building and not know who they were.
But if you were so famous, James, that I wouldn't have your email address and your phone number, then that would create another problem, because I'd say, I've come into contact with James O'Brien.
You'd have to go via Ava, or I don't have an agent at the moment, possibly my publisher. You'd have to say, we're trying to desperately get hold of James O'Brien.
It wouldn't be up to me to do, it'd be up to the test, track and trace system people to do.
And the app, just before, we've put in a call to the... Hang on a minute, you don't know what I'm going to ask you yet. Who do you think you are? Me. I put in a call to the Department of Health, haven't we, this morning, asking for a little reference to any point in the last 3 months where Matt Hancock or anybody else in government referred to the fact that we were actually checking out both apps, the Google Apple one and the sort of homegrown NHSX one.
Which was the claim yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday. Yes. So far, we haven't found any reference to that at all.
No.
We could be looking in the wrong places.
You have found references, of course, to the warnings that Google and Apple weren't willing to accept the privacy and the way that our app, the NHS
and I think we had warnings on this programme that the way Apple was set up would not support the NHSX model as well. Yes. But you, as LBC's esteemed political editor, are unaware prior to yesterday of any reference from this government to the fact that they were actually secretly pursuing, not secretly, because then they were actually overtly pursuing both.
There was no reference to that.
So to what do we owe the pleasure of this visit, Theo?
Because the Joint Biosecurity Centre has recommended that the COVID-19 alert level should be moved down from level 4 to level 3. Level 3, and it is good news because level 4 means that transmission is high or rising exponentially. Level 3 is that virus is in general circulation. In terms of the measures that are in place, when there's level 4, social distancing continues. Level 3, gradual relaxation of the restrictions. Of course, there was criticism that Boris Johnson and the government were relaxing with the non-essential shops reopening, car showrooms reopening, garden centres reopening. Of course, all of those measures came into place before that transition had actually happened.
Yes.
But now, of course, the scientists are recommending that transition from level 4 to level 3 can take place. And, of course, the government will be hoping to move to level 2 in the coming months, and that's where a number of cases of transmission is low and that minimal social distancing is needed. And, of course, that would suggest that if you can get to level 2, you can relax the 2-metre rule. But, of course, we're looking at the moment of relaxing the 2-metre rule before we'd move to level 2,
And
if that
I
goes
think
ahead.
they've already relaxed it in Northern Ireland.
Yes, they have relaxed it in Northern Ireland, in schools, so schools can go back.
So in Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, the schools are more open than they are in England.
In Northern Ireland, they will be, yes.
Northern Ireland in particular, because the holidays are different as well. So I think we're catching up with Mark Drakeford actually shortly, about 10:45, the First Minister of Wales, after the next news headlines, I believe. But again, we're in a slight London bubble. No criticism of you, I am. I've been broadcasting from my shed for the last 3 months. But the national news is almost meaningless in the context of schools, because different parts of our nations
have taken
are
different
doing
decisions.
very, very different things.
Have taken different decisions, but also in different parts of our nations there are different levels. And of course, Northern Ireland and Scotland have seen a faster decline in the levels of infection of coronavirus compared to England.
How likely is it that somebody listening to this programme right now could talk us through what's happened with the app? Because I don't think anyone in government will do so, will they? I mean, how many of these problems do you think were predictable, were visible on the horizon?
They were predicted to people I was speaking to.
All of them, weren't they? I mean, we even had a call from a fellow who said, how about if I come home and my phone picks up my neighbours? I mean, that might still be a problem with the new app. But I think it even came up on Mystery Hour. An 11-year-old child pointed out that your phone will detect next door's phone. You can turn on their Bluetooth speakers if they haven't got their settings sorted out, and yet the government just ploughed on regardless because Dominic is such a genius.
But the government did recognise that there were problems with the app beforehand. That's why Matt Hancock at the end of last month described, having said in the beginning of April that this app was going to solve the problems, it was downgraded from being the cake to the cherry on the cake.
Yes, that's right.
So they did know that there were problems. Of course, the app was meant to launch in the middle of May, and then it got pushed back, and Boris Johnson said there'd be a world-leading... World-beating?
Yes.
World-beating. I'm sure it was world-leading, but...
All right, it's not a bridge either of us need to die on.
Prime Minister's questions before the Whitsun recess, and said that would be in place by the time we MPs got back from their break on June the 1st. And of course, this started. We realised there was going to be a problem. This rollback was being lined up because, of course, in one of the committees yesterday, Lord said that
Lord Bethell
had said yesterday
by the winter. No, not the winter. He said by winter, because that to me left the door open for we never said which winter.
Oh,
we're back to Game of Thrones, aren't we? Now winter is coming. Theo Ushwood, straight over your head. You missed that point almost spectacularly as Dominic Raab did yesterday. Nice to see you, looking so well. 10:30 is the time. I mean, we seek a sort of, not the funny side, but an element of levity into proceedings, because otherwise the diet is so grim and bleak, isn't it? But there's nothing funny about this latest U-turn, this latest abandonment of something that was promised. And my fear today, as I explained to you a moment ago, is that we're almost drowning now in obfuscation and reverse ferrets. Weren't we supposed to have 200,000 tests a day in place by the end of May, I think? Wasn't that? Has everyone just forgotten about that? And as yet, no evidence at all of this trying to ride two horses claim that Matt Hancock made yesterday, that they were all along they were looking at both the Google Apple app and the app that, as far as I can tell, was being put together with sticky back plastic and a couple of used toilet roll holders by a mate of Dominic Cummings. But again, I'm open to persuasion on that one. If you can find reference to that, I'll take it. I'll tell you who might be able to help us. The First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, is on the line. Before we find out whether you've got any secret intelligence on this double app tactic that Matt Hancock unveiled yesterday, First Minister, could you just talk us through what's happening in Welsh schools at the moment?
Yes, certainly, James. So today what I'll be doing is setting out the end of our 3-week review. We are lifting the lockdown in Wales, but trying to do it in an orderly, careful way where people know what is coming and can prepare for it. So Monday of next week, the 22nd, non-essential retail can open. And on the 29th, the following Monday, schools will resume in Wales. Not all children will be back at any one time, but all children will get a chance to check in, catch up, and prepare for the summer, meeting their teachers again, meeting their fellow pupils, so that we can help to prepare for the autumn and they can have that face-to-face contact that we think will make a difference, and every child in Wales will have that opportunity.
Every single one. If we see those children as the bottom of a pyramid, and the messaging, the guidance, the detail is coming from the pinnacle of the pyramid, that would be you. How detailed is the guidance? Because we discussed on the programme yesterday the situation in England, and it was almost as if from one school to the next, the understanding was different of what they should be doing, and the capability of what they could be doing was different as well. So how much... I mean, how firmly is your hand on the tiller of this guidance and this strategy?
Well, we certainly have national guidance that we have issued to all schools in Wales, and that's the same guidance everywhere. But we do try to take a social partnership approach in Wales where we're not just sort of top down. You know, the guidance was designed with schools, with trade unions, with insights from parents as well. It's partly why we've had a long lead-in to reopening schools, to make sure that conversations between parents may be anxious about sending children back, that they've had time to have that with head teachers, know how that particular school is preparing. Schools are very different. We've got some schools in Wales that were built in the 19th century, and we've got a large number of schools built in the 21st century. And what you can do in one sort of building and what you can do in another will differ. So it's a combination of guidance from us and leadership from the Welsh Government, but a lot of grassroots involvement and engagement to get this right on the ground.
And you're confident that most schools, or close to all schools, are clear on what they can and can't do?
I think they will be, because, as I say, we've been so engaged with the people who will be providing education. 450 schools in Wales have been open throughout the whole of coronavirus, you know, providing education to vulnerable children and key worker children. So we've learnt a lot from that as well, from people who've been doing this job for week after week, hearing from them about how to do it successfully.
Talking also about the equipment that has been given to children, particularly digitally excluded children, I'd begin by asking you, I know 3 million, I think, was allocated in April. How different is the situation in Wales compared to other parts of the United Kingdom? How much work have you put into helping children get their hands on laptops? Because I know we're supposed to be heading for 200,000, I think, and they're about halfway there in England. What's the score in Wales?
Well, our focus has been very much on those children who wouldn't have access at home to the facilities that other children and other families can take for granted. There's been a fantastic effort by school staff mobilising equipment that they themselves have been able to put into the system, and then with help from us to buy more. The reason why we are so keen that every child has a chance to come back to school is that we are anxious about that group of children in Welsh society who, without the help that teachers provide direct, will never be in the same position as children who are able to rely on well-informed and well-resourced parents. So throughout the crisis, it's why we've had free school meals available all the way through the summer for weeks and weeks now.
You didn't need Craig Bellamy to intervene on that one.
No, we didn't. Although, you know, we've had lots of support from many people in the sporting world for it. But you know, those are the children that we worry about the most. Yes. That's why we're doing it the way we're doing it.
Last time we spoke, a lot of my listeners were slightly surprised to learn how little contact you'd had with the Prime Minister, with Downing Street and Boris Johnson. Has that situation improved at all?
Well, actually, I would say it's gone in the opposite direction. I've had no contact with any UK minister directly over the whole of this 3 weeks.
What does that mean, Mark? Does that mean that you're, forgive me, your phone is going unanswered or your messages are being unresponded. I mean, I don't understand the intricacies of that level of government. You're the First Minister of Wales. We're in a global pandemic, which obviously is, has swept the country. Good news, of course, I think, I'll ask you in a minute about that, about the reduction in the risk level. But, how hard are you trying to talk to them, if that's an appropriate question?
Look, I should say, to start with, that
yes.
an enormous amount of contact does go on at official level.
Yes.
And my ministerial team are in contact with their equivalents in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Whitehall.
Of course.
But for the bulk of this process, all of that has culminated in a meeting where the First Minister sit round the table together to share information, understand what one another are doing and sign off the final arrangements. I was myself genuinely surprised that there was no COBRA meeting at the end of the last 3-week process, because that's the way it had been happening. And as I say, 3 weeks has now gone by without any contact at all. And I have lost count, James, of the times that I have said over recent weeks that we need a regular, reliable rhythm of meetings in which the 4 component parts of the United Kingdom can get together to make better decisions. And that can't happen if the UK government is absent in action. And so we have a meeting today with Michael Gove, as I said.
Yes.
I hope that will reset this.
Okay.
And over the weeks ahead, we will have a predictable pattern of engagement between us. Because I want the United Kingdom to succeed. And the United Kingdom can't succeed in the way it should if we're not round the table together. 2
more questions, but briefly, presumably you welcome the lowering of the alert level on the advice of chief medical officers from 4 to 3 today.
Yes, we've had a traffic light system in Wales, moving from red to amber to green. The red was the equivalent of a 4 on the UK scale, and that's where we've been. The changes we will make today move Wales into the amber zone. And the amber zone is broadly equivalent to level 3 on the UK scale. So, yes, of course, I do welcome that.
And finally, can you talk us through what's happened with the apps?
We have been waiting for the app to be released from the Isle of Wight for many weeks now. We've long come to the conclusion that we can't rely on that happening. So our test, trace, protect system doesn't rely on that app coming our way at all. We have in Wales been part of the King's College Zoe app, as it's called. I do it myself every day. It does help us to get an insight into the prevalence of the disease here in Wales.
This is the one that tracks symptoms, I think.
Yes, this is the one. Yes, and it tells you how many people you think you've got as symptomatic in different parts of Wales. It's been very helpful to us, but it's one of a suite of measures that we used. It's many weeks since we thought that we could rely on the Isle of Wight's outcome to be a central part of what we are doing. So if it does emerge in some sort of way and it's helpful, then of course we will be keen to use it. But if it doesn't emerge at all, it really will not be central to our approach.
So to be clear, you've been operating on the presumption that it may not appear at all, even as Boris Johnson was standing up in the House of Commons and telling us it would be in place by the beginning of June.
Well, because we've known that the progress has not been what it was expected to be and that there have been a series of technical issues with it, we took the decision that we couldn't build our system around its availability. If something emerges, all well and good. If nothing comes our way, it won't make a difference.
Mark Drakeford, First Minister of Wales, many thanks as always for your time this morning, and good luck getting hold of the Prime Minister. If I'll have a word with some of my colleagues, see if they've got a secret phone number. It's coming up to 10:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we will return our attention next to the question of this app and the mystery of why they never told us they were trying to keep both horses in the race. Only yesterday, as far as we can tell, and we've put in a call to the Department of Health, so if there is any evidence on the record, I'm sure they'll be supplying it imminently. How have we ended up in a position where what was supposed to be launched at the beginning of June now may or may not be in place by winter? And actually, I don't know if it's too early to ask you this question, but What happened to all the money that we spent on the old one that's now been abandoned? Do they have to pay it back? I mean, in some areas of commerce, I presume that if you muff up on this sort of scale, then you're held responsible for it. There's penalties to pay, you know? I drove into the congestion charge by accident the other day and got sent a bill in the post. How can you spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on technology that doesn't work and walk away scot-free? It's 10:45. Back to the phones, to the app, to the mystery of why haven't we got 200,000 tests in place when he promised that we would have? Why haven't we got an app up and running like by the beginning of June, like he promised that we would have? Why are we still seeing this man talk about being world-beating and congratulating himself on the rare occasions that he appears in the front of camera for presiding over such a magnificent strategy when it is by most measures the worst in the world? And it still gets worse. Good news today about the alert level, down from 4 to 3 on the advice of the chief medical officers. Make no mistake, that is good news. Could have happened sooner. Could have happened with, according to Professor Lockdown himself, Neil Ferguson, could have happened with tens of thousands of fewer deaths. But that doesn't mean that you can't be pleased that it's happened at all. Better late than never. It's been our watchword all along. But here we are now looking at the app. Tech failure. Tech failure. Remember when ministers resigned if they presided over epic failures? Yeah, feels like a different age. Chris is in Tower Hamlets. Chris, what can you tell us?
Yeah, James, thank you for bringing this topic up this morning, and I hope you're going to keep going with asking them for clear evidence that he ever said that, because, I mean, I'm a bit of a news nerd. I mean, I tend to watch, and listen to virtually every news programme going, and I sometimes, watch select committee hearings and whatever. I honestly don't believe he has ever once said that he was working on those two apps. I agree with you totally.
I can't remember it, but we could both perhaps. We might have both nodded off. We might have got into the next room to make a cup of tea. That someone might have torn that piece out of our newspaper that day, Chris. I mean, I don't want to conclude certainly that it was never, ever mentioned before yesterday. No. But you and I can't remember seeing it. Let's just leave it at that.
And when you're asking them that question, James, you might ask them why the Google Apple app is currently in use in Germany now, today, as we speak, this Friday. It's in operation now. Why is it in operation in Germany and not in the United Kingdom? As we know, Germany was far more successful at keeping deaths under control than the UK. They're using the app now.
Do you know much about this sector? I don't mean that in a condescending. No, nor do I.
No,
but I think it's not just in Germany, is it? There are other countries as well that have deployed the Google Apple, and I think some of them arrived at the same conclusion about a so-called centralised system some weeks ago. So they had a look at what we were still trying to do up until, I don't know, yesterday morning, Wednesday evening, and realised it wouldn't work, so they went all in on Google Apple. The problem, of course, with having unelected bureaucrats at the very centre of our government is that no one ever gets to ask them questions. So presumably it was Dominic Cummings that decided to bet the house on this homegrown app, and I've seen some reports that AI companies involved in Vote Leave got a piece of the action. I need to double-check that for clarity. But we don't get the chance to ask why. Why did you bet the house on this when other countries had already decided it was a dud?
Correct. COVID Cummings, as I like to think of him.
That might catch on, actually, but I don't. I'm not ready yet. So, of course, with the matters of life and death still unfolding, the temptation to overreach for levity is almost irresistible, Chris. I completely concur. Does anybody else know? I mean, what would happen in the private sector if you promised the Earth but we were simultaneously examining the plausibility of Uranus? So we've now decided to go with Uranus because we can't deliver you the Earth by the beginning of June. And we never mentioned the fact that we were going to be betting the house on Uranus, having already bet the house on the Earth, but that doesn't mean that we weren't doing it secretly. There is another app, but it goes to a different school. Niels is in Reigate in Surrey. Niels, what can you tell us?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
I've obviously been following the whole COVID-19 saga since we started the lockdown and so on, and I've been wanting to call in many times about various misjudgments that have been made by various.
What field are you in, if you don't mind me asking?
Sorry?
What's your? Do you have a professional interest in it, or are you just like me, marvelling from the sidelines?
No, I was a technology director for over 20 years.
That'll do, mate. Fill your boots.
So I've been following this app development thing for a couple of weeks now. And basically what happened was that back in April time, Google and Apple announced that they were going to jointly develop an API that would allow government health departments and private companies develop the applications that would be required to tie into the app, the technology on the phone, to allow them to basically talk to software in the NHS or track and trace or wherever it might be, so that the technology in the phone would talk to those as best as possible.
Right.
And this joint announcement was made back in mid-April, and there was I think his name is Michael Veal, a guy over here, wrote to the government and said, look, we've been studying this technology, and we definitely think this is something that should be looked at instead of going down the NHSX route. And the government turned around and said, no, we're fine, we're going to continue doing this.
This is the Digital Rights and Regulation guy at UCL?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the Turing Institute as well.
You know, what's happened is that in the meantime, Switzerland and Germany have gone ahead and developed their apps. Germany...
Is there a difference between... Can I come back to you after the news? You sound like you know what you're talking about, which, frankly, Niels, that makes one of us in the context of this conversation. So I'm going to head to the news, and I'll come back to you, because you've got... I don't know whether you're good at it, you might be faking it, but you have an air of authority, Niels, that, frankly... Well, it's hard to think of anybody in government about whom we could currently say the same. So here we are with our world-beating app that isn't going to happen after all, because we were having a look at another app all along, but we just neglected to mention to anybody ever that we were looking at the other app all along, and all the other countries that had already elected to go with the other app. Yeah, you're getting an idea now of why that word was coined by Armando Iannucci when he was writing The Thick of It, which I could never dream of. But I can say omnishambles, can't I? It's 11 o'clock. I'm going to read you a quote from a spokesman for Apple that is in some newspapers today. And you know how worried I get that you don't get all the information you need to make informed decisions. Brexit. This to me is chilling, right? A spokesman for Apple, in response to Matt Hancock's speech yesterday, claiming that they were kind of combining the two apps that they'd been looking at all along into some new app that we might have by winter. A spokesman for Apple said, "We don't know what they mean by this hybrid model. They haven't spoken to us about it." Now, I've been worrying a bit. I'll be back to Niels in less than 60 seconds, mate. I'm sorry to delay you. I've been worrying a tiny bit that because I have spent a long time telling you the truth about Boris Johnson and the truth about the tides that swept him into Downing Street, I've been worried that I should have kept my powder drier, that I should perhaps have... But no, because this is all of a piece. That's the whole point, isn't it? And I will not be gaslit into silence or submission. Everything about the man and his track record in life, not just in politics or journalism, but in every single aspect of his life, should have warned us that this would all happen. Catastrophe, chaos, laziness, absence, disappearance, dithering, delay, deceit, denial, delusion, at every turn. And now we have the Secretary of State for Health, a man who sold his soul last year, standing in front of you and talking about a new approach to testing and tracing that will be put together in cooperation with Apple. And what do Apple say? We don't know what they mean by this. They haven't spoken to us about it. Now just pause, forget your politics, take your scarf off, pretend that Brexit never happened. Okay, we're all in the same team, we're all on the same boat. What would happen if you did that at work? What would happen if you stood up in front of all the shareholders or the board or all your colleagues, if you stood up in front of everybody in the factory or everybody in the office and said, we've got this magnificent new thing and we're going to do it with Joe? And then Joe poked his head around the door and went, I've never heard anything about this. What would happen to you at work? You see now why this is serious. Well, you knew already that it was serious. But you see why, good news about the alert level notwithstanding, my goodness me, there are some questions still to be answered. Let's go back to Niels. We're going to talk enough to Dr. Michael Veal, actually, Niels, in about 24 minutes. I think it was you that mentioned him a moment ago. But just talk us through, if you can. I think that you were just knocking at the door of international comparisons. Yeah,
so Germany have built their app using this joint technology that's been developed by Google and Apple. And as far as I'm aware, what Google and Apple did was basically say, look, you don't have to develop two versions of your app for iOS and Android and worry about Bluetooth and all that sort of stuff. Use our toolkit. You can develop one app. It can be released on both platforms. And as far as I'm aware, the other thing, and I'm sure that Dr. Michael Veal will talk more about this, is that they will, in the same way as they develop their normal operating systems, they will continue to release upgrades and so on for these apps. So Germany built theirs. They released it on, I think, Monday or Tuesday, and they've had 10 million downloads as of this morning.
So... you just couldn't make it up, could you? In fact, if you did, no one would believe you. And were you aware of this quote from Apple that I just read out?
I wasn't, no. I hadn't seen that.
We don't know what they mean by this hybrid model. They haven't spoken to us about it. I mean, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and it can't be done, because as you just told us, it's been done in Germany. But you'd expect Apple to be at least aware of what the Secretary of State of Health was saying about them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that the government have been misleading us about is that if they had been backing both horses, as Matt Hancock said yesterday, then why can't they turn the Apple-Google one on today? That's what...
Oh, yes, of course.
That's what,
because they've done all the background work that's necessary by dint of the fact that they've been looking at the possibility of deploying it all along. Yeah,
but then James Cleverly, on Question Time last night... when asked about this, whether it had been tested, he said, no, we don't have to test the Apple and Google one because that's been in use elsewhere, so we don't need to test it.
Right, bless him. I can't watch Question Time anymore because you never know what sort of flotsam and jetsam's going to wash up on your screen. But didn't he also say that we don't have far-right marches in the UK anymore?
Yeah.
He's going to be gutted when he finds out about Sunday, isn't he? Niels, thank you, mate. Your decades as a technology director have never been put to better use. I'm only sorry I can't pay you. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. And a spokesman for Apple said, in response to Matt Hancock's announcement yesterday that they were working with Apple on bringing the best bits of both systems together, a spokesman for Apple said, we don't know what they mean by this hybrid model. They haven't spoken to us about it. Oh, I think someone rang Eddie yesterday. I got a heads up on Twitter. I was doing my daily exercise. Someone rang Eddie, who'll be with you at 4 o'clock this afternoon, to complain that James O'Neill is always putting the boot into this government. And I did find myself thinking, I hope he rings me today and tells me what we should actually be celebrating. If you're listening, sir, I'd love to know what it is about the fact that Matt Hancock announced something yesterday involving Apple that Apple have never heard of. How would you report on this in a more positive and upbeat way and stop being so doom and gloom and pessimistic? And I'll tell you what, I'll make you a promise. If you ring me and tell me how you could report on Matt Hancock announcing a collaboration with Apple that Apple know nothing about, I won't make you count the corpses in answer to the question of how we could be reporting all of this more positively or in a more upbeat fashion. 10 minutes after 11, Neil is in Piccadilly. Neil, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning.
Hello.
So, I wanted to come to talk to you on a professional and a personal level about this app.
Blimey.
So, I'm an IT tech of some 20-plus years.
Okay.
Apple, as you're probably aware, have a very, very strict set of guidelines and, rules, effectively, for any apps that appear on their phone.
Yes.
They have to adhere to a very strict set of guidelines. And the one thing that Apple are very hot on, or one of the things, is data privacy.
Yes.
Your data belongs to you. It's why they went ahead with Touch ID and Face ID, and they have very stringent guidelines about what sections of your phone any app that goes on the App Store can use.
Okay.
So they have, without getting too dull, they have...
It's not dull, it might be technical, but it's not dull. It's really important.
Okay.
Excuse me. I understand why you use that word, but don't, because we need to understand it. So keep it layman, if you like, but not dull.
All right, fair enough. So they have a secure section of the phone where data does not leave your phone.
Yes.
when you send a message over iMessage to someone else with a phone, it's completely encrypted from me to you.
Yes.
No one else can get a look at that.
And that's caused some problems in criminal cases, hasn't it, when they've wanted to access messages from people that may or may not have been involved in crimes. But Apple have elected from very, very early on to safeguard user privacy.
Absolutely. They'll openly say we do not design our operating system with any kind of backdoor in place. And yes, the situations that you describe have arisen with the FBI and various other options. So yeah, Apple are they consider privacy a human right. So the problem with the NHS app is that it wanted to centralise your data, and it wants to just put it in a nice central pot, and it'll mine, as much as it can, which then opens up a risk that there's a lot of data in a single place.
Yes.
And, we've all been there with the stories of the CDs getting left in Starbucks and USB keys, etc. And that, for me, is the reason
they had to go down a different road. Okay, I'm going to say something. I'm going to say something which I have no real understanding of, and you're going to tell me whether it's true or not, okay?
Okay.
It's because Apple and Google forbid any app using their API that the UK had to build its own without any help from them.
Kind of, yes. In essence, yes. The UK went to, the NHSX people went to Apple and said, look, we want to do this and we want to put this app on your phone. And Apple said, no, because you want to do X, Y, Z.
Because the data is... And then we've got this, and my thanks as ever to I'm Incorrigible for doing some digging while I'm talking. This is from the 5th of May in a publication called The Verge. In addition to privacy issues, researchers have identified a major problem in the UK's efforts to build an app without Google and Apple. It simply won't work as advertised. 5th of May, Neil. The 5th of flipping, it's my wedding anniversary.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And they don't, the NHS, bless them, just don't have the resources that, people like Apple and Google do.
So what's your understanding of why they did it then? I mean, and you can go a little bit tinfoil hat if you want, because I know the idea of them being desperate to get their hands on all our data. I mean, even a cursory understanding of what happened in the June of 2016 will tell you why Dominic Cumming thinks getting his hands on our data is of more importance than probably anything else. But don't go too far. Just tell me what you honestly think, your honest theory.
Well, I think you're on the money with that. One thing I've kind of learned from your show over the last couple of years is follow the money.
Yes.
And from what the research that I've done, it would appear that buddies of Dominic Cummings were developing the NHSX app. And I've got to tell you, those same guys, as I'm sure you're already ahead of me, worked on the Leave campaign.
Yes.
And actually that much data that they know about, us as a society, that just frightens the living daylights out of me.
I completely understand why. In their defence, or rather by way of a counter or a corrective to your fears, and possibly mine as well, to be fair to you, Neil, other countries did flirt with the idea of doing a DIY version as well. And I think some have stuck with it. So, and they don't have a track record of harvesting data to persuade an entire population to vote against its own interests.
Yeah, but we could have equally, by using the same kind of train of thought as all the other countries, we could have got someone that wasn't involved with vote leave.
Might have been nice,
didn't have an ulterior, motive. We could have gone to one,
or even open the door to suspicions of an ulterior motive. He says,
absolutely,
trying to legal his own radio show as it unfolds live across the nation.
Yeah, but they absolutely could have thrown it open to tender and said, right, like they did with the NHS volunteers.
Yes, exactly.
They could have said, right, technical people, we're always, we're giving tax breaks and stuff to all the big companies up in around
They did it with the ventilators. They did it with the ventilators. They said anyone can come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, but not on this. Oddly.
Exactly. But a physical product that really after that its initial use doesn't hold a benefit from them, so they can put that out to tender. But something about
I get it.
Every
No, these are the questions that we would usually expect to get answers to. We would seek answers, but we are of course talking about a man who told an entire nation that he drove 60 miles to test his eyesight. and got away with it. Thank you, Neil. It's 11:16, where we continue to seek to understand what happened with this app. It was supposed to be in place by June. It was going to be world-beating. It was going to allow us to be supremely confident about the loosening of the lockdown. And then yesterday, it just died, disappeared, to be replaced by something that will involve a collaboration with Apple, at which point a spokesman for Apple said, "We don't know what they mean by this hybrid model. They haven't spoken to us about it," a spokesman said. Can anyone make sense of this? And some of the fears, I'm legally nervous. That's the only reason I'm not allowing people to go in a little bit deeper on some of the firms that appear to have been entrusted with some of the contracts in this field. There are others. I can recommend Open Democracy. They're brilliant at this. In fact, if you follow me on Twitter, I'll retweet an article from them that you can have a look at. I'm not embarrassed, but I think it's important to admit I don't fully understand every element of this sort of technology, when technology meets journalism in this way, and indeed the law, but I know that there were freedom of information requests that were agreed to belatedly and possibly even reluctantly, 20 minutes after 11. James is in Harlow. James, what would you like to say?
Hey, James.
Hello, mate.
I suppose, just to preface this, I want to say that your last caller, I forget his name, he made some excellent points on Apple's prioritisation of privacy.
Mate, we're going to try and sort your phone line out, James, and we'll come back to you in a moment, I promise, but I was losing about one word in three there. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Let's head over to Northern Ireland. Alan is in County Down in Rostrevor. Alan, what would you like to say?
How are you, James? Are you okay?
I'm grand, yeah. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
I've done it again. I've done it again. We had a conversation earlier this week about how we were speaking to a lad in Australia, Alan, and I commented on how his accent, even though he'd been there for 2.5 years, he'd already picked up an Australian accent. And someone tweeted to say, I think it was Wayne, every time someone rings from Ireland and they ask me how I am, I say I'm grand. I never say it to anybody else. It's like some weird sort of verbal osmosis that I suffer from the minute I hear an accent. Anyway, I digress. What did you want to tell us?
Right, so as you digress, I just kick straight into it. So the company that I run, we build applications for professional spokesmen. I won't bore you with all of that part.
Okay.
But we also build applications that hardware that communicates over Bluetooth with both Android and, which is Google, and iOS, which is Apple. And it's been standard that has always been problems with communicating with Bluetooth with Apple devices. And every time, won't go too technical, but every time Apple change your phone and change chipsets, we all have experienced it. They update software and stuff disconnects and your car doesn't connect and your headset doesn't connect. These problems are synonymous.
Yes.
And the source code for this application, my understanding, because some of our software guys showed it to me, was released or leaked maybe 6 weeks ago. And we all kind of chuckled when we looked at it because the problems that they were having were the problems we would have had a year ago trying to do the same thing. So long story short is surely the best way of doing this would have been going into the industry in the United Kingdom and asking people who've
done it
been
before
there and done that. Yeah, but because I have a saying that intellectual property...
But that would be like asking businesses and experts about things, wouldn't it? And they've kind of done quite well over the last few years by ignoring expert opinion. And,
well, this is it exactly. And I was saying that intellectual property is predominantly mistakes.
Sure.
You learn from mistakes, you improve. That's the way it is. And there will be dozens, if not hundreds, of companies up and down the United Kingdom who've had this problem with Bluetooth communication.
Right.
And again, I have to emphasise it's different with Apple and Google, or Android and iOS, that they both communicate completely differently. The simplest solution was the solution that Apple and Google made for the world, which was make it open source to the point, give it an API. So it's like literally putting an extension cable on your
and
TV
the data ends up nowhere. Is that for you the crucial constituent of this conversation is that what was the major difference that might explain why they went all in on this one that hasn't worked and elected not to pursue the one that has been shown to work elsewhere? And the answer I keep hearing is because on the DIY one, they would, and there were various promises about how long they'd keep it for and what they'd do with it. But this is, of course, a fellow who claimed that he'd driven to Barnard Castle to test his eyes. So the issue of trust is pertinent. It is relevant here, I'm afraid. I wish it wasn't, but it is. And it's all about data. That would be the advantage of this one, was that it got them loads and loads of data that they wouldn't otherwise get.
Well, look, at the end of the day, anybody that's looking at anything that's happening around the world, from how social media companies are affecting countries, from the Philippines right through to the American elections, Brexit. There's a very good headline in The Economist 2 years ago where it said, for the first time ever, data is more valuable than oil.
Yes.
That was the headline. Data is more valuable than oil because you can do what happened with elections and everything else around the world. Yeah. So the cynic would say exactly what you've just said, that the Apple and Google version, you don't get the data. It just is simply an application that will tell you the minimum you need to know to use the app efficiently for what it's built for, which is tracing people. You don't find. But
that's the point, Alan. That's the question I'd like to ask you: is can you think of any other reason why they might have favoured the centralised DIY version over the decentralised, internationally proven version? And I mean this question in very good faith, for the record. I genuinely would love to hear your expert opinion on what other advantages it may have had.
I will say it this way.
Go on.
If you're going to the pub and you want to go home after a few beers, you have two choices. You can phone a taxi, which will take you home, or you can buy a Ferrari. They'll both take you home. Yes. But essentially, one makes sense and one doesn't make sense, and the other one just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, really, to be frankly honest with you. So
I'm the last man in the land who's allowed to have a crack at someone else for strained analogies. But that was heavy. I love that one. You can phone for a minute. You get an Uber or get a black cab, get a taxi, phone for a taxi, or you can buy yourself a Ferrari and wait for it to be delivered. It really is that stark to you. The absolute, data collection aside, bafflement at why they elected to go down this road instead of the other one.
Well, yes, Jason. Again, as I said, it's not just this is with the app, this is with everything else. And I listened to what you said earlier on as well, kind of slightly changing direction about accountability. You know, if any other industry done what they've done, you'd be wheeled in front of your management.
I would have thought so. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'll go a different way. When we build anything, we sit down in a room, we argue quite a bit, which is healthy.
Yes, of course.
We argue about what the best way of doing things. You come up with a conclusion, and then you go and evaluate that, and then you move forward. If you're evaluating this with experts, the first thing you would have discovered was, well, it's not just black and white using Bluetooth with Android and iOS devices. It's pretty difficult. There's a lot of problems with it. That would have been 101 in that evaluation meeting. Unless, of course, there wasn't an evaluation meeting and there was just some other reason, which is probably what you would do. You know?
Again, this is often the way. You'll know more about this than I ever will. This is often the way with government IT projects. It's not unique to this government or indeed to this project, but there are elements of this that seem to be particularly problematic, particularly troublesome. Can I take your analogy and raise you another example and tell me what you think?
Go ahead, yeah.
So you're in the pub, you've had a few. You need to get home. You can either phone for a taxi or buy a Ferrari, you said. Are you sure they're not just drink driving?
Yeah, well, by the time the Ferrari comes, you probably have sobered up and you've looked at your bank balance. You probably have done that.
Yes.
The point being, one's ludicrous and one's common sense.
Yes.
And somebody always says, common sense ain't that common anymore.
But this government seemed to be... Actually, it's an even better analogy than I realised, because you can see how... If someone knew nothing and there was a fella in the room pretending to know everything, you could quite easily persuade, why on earth would we phone for a taxi when we could buy our own Ferrari?
That would be, but as I said, the world is... the strange thing about all of this is 5 years ago, and I mean 5 years ago isn't that long a time ago.
I know.
people used experts, took expert advice, took expert opinion before they made decisions, documented everything. So when the decision was made, if it ended up being an error or a mistake, there would be a document trail to say this is why we came to that conclusion.
You're right, and
that seems
good luck.
But that seems to have vanished in the last 5 years.
Well, that's why you led me back to that word accountability. Alan, you've led me right up to the news, but I'll leave that thought hanging. Have a look at this lot. You had the fella yesterday claiming that taking the knee, inspired by the American football player Colin Kaepernick, himself inspired by the civil rights movement, going right back to Dr. Martin Luther King and possibly beyond. You had a cabinet minister, a foreign secretary no less, claiming that he believed it had come from the Game of Thrones TV show or book, a book almost entirely about white people and dragons. So quite how that could ever have ended up inspiring the Black Lives Matter movement, God only knows. But you tell me whether or not you think this is plausible. In a room that contains people like Priti Patel and Dominic Raab and Matt Hancock and Oliver Dowden and Gavin Williamson, they're all sitting there knowing absolutely nothing, but desperate to avoid anybody pointing it out. And they're all chatting to each other and they're all saying, well, I think we should get a minicab home. Don't you? You know, we've all had a drink. Let's get a minicab. I'll phone for a minicab. Pretty, Dom, you everyone ready? We'll get a minicab. And then someone says, well, Dominic Cummings says we can buy our own Ferrari. I love Alan's analogy. And I'd like to withdraw my earlier criticism of it, where this app concerns us for a little longer, and then we might move on to schools. I know we talked about schools yesterday, but the great worry now is you want it to be true. This is the weirdest thing about the footballification of everything. Even if you're under no illusions whatsoever about the competence and credibility of Boris Johnson going back decades, you still want him to get this right. And just because they've got every single thing wrong so far, that's number 10 I'm talking about, not number 11. I think Rishi Sunak has got quite a lot right. Doesn't mean that they'll get everything wrong going forward. But the £1 billion that they're going to spend on helping pupils in England catch up on lost learning, it's worrying on two levels. Number one, the track record of epic incompetence at almost every turn. And number two, these are people who voted to close libraries and cut funding to schools. So the idea that they've suddenly developed a deep concern for the welfare of the nation's most vulnerable children is, to say the least, optimistic. An earlier caller, I think it was Niels in Reigate, referenced Dr. Michael Veal, you'll remember, a lecturer in digital rights and regulations at UCL, and somebody who has been following the app development, or indeed non-development, very closely. And I'm delighted to say that Dr. Veal joins me on the line now. Were you the least surprised doctor in the land yesterday as that press conference unfolded, Michael?
Possibly, although it's surprising it's taken this long to get here. I mean, I'm part of the team that developed the alternative decentralized approach that Apple and Google adapted for their in their operating system.
Right.
And we've been developing this since February and March.
On whose sort of say so, if that's not a silly question?
Oh, I mean, just on our own impetus with 8 universities across Europe. We don't get paid for it. We just release everything freely.
So as open source, not just, academically very exciting and challenging, but actually justified by the prospect of it actually being used.
Oh, indeed, and our app is being used in Switzerland and many other countries.
No, I understand that. I didn't realise, forgive me, I'm on a bit of a crash course myself this morning. I didn't realise that the sort of seed technology was in place as a result of the work of you and your colleagues, and then Apple and Google sort of come along and provide an amplification and a dissemination sort of service.
Yeah, that's likely built into their operating system, which is, these big companies, of course, have huge amounts of power, and we shouldn't be any under illusion. We may want to control that power.
Yes, very wise.
But the fact is, because we haven't regulated these companies properly in years, every government that wants to make an app enters a public-private partnership with these firms in practice. And if they want to fix that, I think they should have an ambitious legislative agenda and actually use the powers they have.
But now wouldn't be the time.
I don't think now is the time to overhaul the way we interact with tech companies in a thoughtful and considered way. Parliament's not even effectively sitting in the House of Commons, at least.
So it was June the 18th yesterday. I appreciate you're already aware of that. I'm just getting my ducks in a row. And I'm reading you being quoted on May the 5th, which means you probably said it sooner than that, but it was published in The Verge on May the 5th.
I emailed the government.
Just let me get this out for my listeners. Digital rights expert Michael Veal, who is also part of an international consortium developing decentralised contract tracing protocols, says there really is no way to build a contract tracing system, contact tracing system, without the help of Apple and Google. So, I mean, that was early May, and presumably you were saying that in February and March as well.
Yeah, well, so February, March, it was, it's been this case all the time, and there has been a need for cooperation and collaboration. I emailed the government to tell them that exactly what would happen on April the 11th. Actually.
Right. Good grief, really? So you predicted what happened yesterday, or what was announced yesterday, you told them would happen back in the second week of April?
Yes, it was technically clear at that point. All the documentation was out, and it was not really contentious and
So what do you think happened then, Michael? And I appreciate you're a scientist, so you're probably not that comfortable speculating too much. But how do you account for that ticking of time, especially in the context of a life and death pandemic?
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of set of developments. I think to some extent there was some groupthink and perhaps some hubris around the kind of England exceptionalism here. And bear in mind, NHS X is actually just NHS England.
Yes, of course.
I believe Ireland is even potentially piloting an app today based on the Apple Google system. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's worth following up.
Yes, of course it is. So just this sense that we will do better because we're us.
I mean, this I think is part of it, and there wasn't the open collaboration with academics or other countries that was really clear at that point. When there were, from what I've heard, when there were international meetings, they were only with the countries developing a centralised approach, never with the countries developing an alternative approach. And this was, this is of course quite problematic. And this alternative architecture, I think, there were letters. There was a letter from the UK from 200 academics addressed to the UK government, suggesting that this was a poor approach. There was an international letter from 600 addressed from all different governments. Germany itself switched very early on in April.
As a result of that pressure, partly, you think, and also as a result of results, as a result of research.
Exactly, the result of both. I mean, in practice, I think we can say we can be very critical of Apple and Google in many ways. Apple have built hardware which is more privacy preserving than Google's and than hardware used to be in general, and that means they have a lot of discretion and power to choose what software runs on the device.
Of course.
And I'm not sure that was quite appreciated early on and particularly in the context that this was totally possible to run an effective contact tracing system as an app, as far as we understand it, within the constraints of that system.
If they'd bet the house on your app, when could it have conceivably have been up and running effectively?
Well, I think quite soon. So if that was a decision that was made early on. So take Germany, for example. Germany is the alternative. Germany started centralised, and that's fine because, there was confusion at the beginning. The ideas weren't.
And this is uncharted territory, isn't it, in many ways?
Exactly.
Yes.
And they flipped in April to our approach, and then people from my team have been working with them, and they set up the new companies and things that were going to work and develop this. The German app was released on Monday in full form. Has garnered 10 million downloads, I think, already, which is a larger portion of the German population, especially when you subtract under 16s and people who are shielding, who we don't expect to need or use the app.
Sure.
Because the app is actually about protecting others. You don't want to get to the people who are shielding at that point. Similarly with under 16s. So this is already a significant number of people. And so it could have been that timeline, even if we'd changed our mind, I think.
Right.
And the UK had already been quite advanced with some other parts of the app. They'd already developed the user interface. And, I know they were very slow to link the testing centres to the app, and that was a different set of challenges that Germany didn't have. That links to the general issues around testing management.
Okay.
But it could have been much faster.
And I appreciate your comments about exceptionalism, and I stress again that we're in the realms of theory. But I'd forgotten until you reminded me about the letters. I don't know if I can even remember the 600-strong international letter, but the 200-strong domestic letter from UK academics and scientists. What do you think they were putting on the other side of the scales, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, so these are all very interesting points. So earlier on, in the process, the UK was also the only country in the world that wanted to run an app using only self-reported data.
Right.
So the idea that you wouldn't have an official verified test, but you could trigger other people into quarantine by just entering your symptoms and saying, I promise I have these symptoms.
And this could have led to all manner of vexatious behaviours.
Exactly. And so their initial idea, which the epidemiologists that we were working with said this is madness, their initial idea was then if they had a centralised database, they could do some sort of unspecified fraud analysis to understand who was actually fraudulently reporting symptoms or not. And mathematically, I don't believe this would ever have worked. And I think they must have come to the conclusion too. And
is this
really
again, sorry to interrupt you, just is this again somebody somewhere thinking that behavioural science would be somehow more reliable than epidemiology, or am I mishearing you?
I think it's a mix. It's that and the fact we just didn't have tests and they weren't fast enough.
Ah, yes, of course.
So the other countries who were deploying the app had no problem returning a test within 24 hours. And
because they had the tests.
The government is very unwilling to release speed data on tests.
Yes.
So it does all link into this. And so these are all clear design decisions, but really they're all interlinked with the whole intervention. So it's not quite a case of just maliciousness or hubris on its own.
Exactly, yes.
There were sensible that you can't really extricate this debacle from the testing debacle, the lack of speedy tests, and you can't really extricate it from other issues, and also the lack of international cooperation, because interoperability among these apps has been a key priority for many other countries around going on holiday and so on. And that doesn't seem to have been a focus in the UK.
And it would have been impossible to get a bead on it earlier, because the official line was at the time that the decision to cease testing on anything like a helpful scale was not taken for reasons of testing shortages, but was instead taken for other, I can't even remember what reasons they gave, but we know the truth now. Finally, Dr. Veal, there's just one line from an Apple spokesman in response to Matt Hancock's press conference yesterday. I'd love to just hear your straight reaction to it. We don't know what they mean by this hybrid model. They haven't spoken to us about it.
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well, that actually the UK government haven't asked to speak to either company in several weeks. So that's... Again, I don't know that for sure. No. And that would have to be some of the companies would say.
No, but that's an Apple spokesman. It's not a source. It's a spokesman. It's an on-the-record quote.
Yeah. So that tallies up with what I've heard. What's interesting now is that the hybrid model they're suggesting, as far as I can tell, it does deal with a valid grievance, but it's not one that either us as a research team or Apple and Google have ignored or are continuing to ignore. It's well on our radar, and it's in the development trajectory.
Got you.
So the challenge is, yes, even in a decentralized system, phones have different types of Bluetooth they send out. You could have an old phone or a new phone, and Bluetooth wasn't designed for measuring distance. So it helps if you know a little bit about the phone that you're hearing, what model it is, for example.
Okay.
But if you do that, it can make you be tracked around malls and shopping malls and smart cities and all these things. And phones typically try to avoid putting out persistent identifiers, which is like kind of a constant tag that allows you to be tracked around for a whole day. So there's a trade-off there that's really important to balance, and we're working on balancing it right now, and it's and that's that's something that's underway. I don't think it's something the NHS have just discovered and no one else has noticed.
Sure, and finally, and I mean this most sincerely, briefly, because I'm already late for the next break. Could you give us some grounds for optimism moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of systems are rolling out, and we're going to find out and work out if they work well, because it's still a big experiment. If they work actually to help fight the disease. I'm just hopeful that the UK can take the huge amount of open source code that other countries have put out and adapt it much quicker than they think they need to, because that's what we've been doing, putting everything out openly, no copyright or IP, free for anyone to use, and they should do.
And that's about a mile and a half away from Downing Street. You've been doing this 2 or 3 miles. No.
Oh yeah, well around the world actually.
I know, but I'm looking for a headline, Michael. You know how it works. It's just around the corner. Have you heard from them at all in the last few days, weeks?
No,
not at all.
No, not at all.
And you are at the vanguard of international research into test and tracing apps. This particular.
Yeah, I'm involved in a team doing that. They were consulting with me and colleagues at the very, very beginning, and that then went silent.
Dr. Michael Veal, lecturer in digital rights and regulation at UCL. A bit of déjà vu there. I don't know about you, but it's almost like the First Minister of Wales trying to get hold of the Prime Minister. Except this is the other way around. Here you have international research, international academia addressing this question, but clearly UCL front and centre in that process. Hasn't heard from them in weeks. Go on, give me a call. Tell me how we can report this in a more upbeat and positive way. It's 11:47.
Global's Make Some Noise, raising money to help those hit hardest by coronavirus in our communities.
Supported by HSBC UK.
LBC.
11:51 is the time, and it is indeed to Global's Make Some Noise that I draw your attention next. This is an emergency appeal that is designed to help those hit hardest by coronavirus in our communities, and it is local charities that provide the most valuable lifelines for those experiencing an array of problems, from grief, poverty, domestic abuse and loneliness, through to other illnesses and mental health problems. Everybody needs help at some point in their lives, but at times like this, people who are already vulnerable need your help more than ever. And it's not just the front line now, in the short term, it's also in the months to come, as demand for these sort of services will continue to be much higher than usual. We identify charities across the country who are small and perhaps too busy trying to help people to undertake the sort of fundraising, marketing and public relations operations that much bigger charities can do. These are not, for example, in the main charities that would ever be benefiting from the charity fundraisers, the chuggers that we used to bump into pre-lockdown so often on our streets. So the one I want to talk to you about now is called Kids Inspire. And Kids Inspire provides therapeutic support to vulnerable children, young people and families affected by an array of issues again, but more on the mental side of the street than the physical side. So mental health problems, emotional, behavioural difficulties, trauma, and of course the consequent responses to that, family conflict, self-harming behaviours, suicidal ideation, and even child-to-parent violence. They've adapted in the last few weeks to deliver therapeutic provision remotely. So what would once have been done face-to-face is now being done via video call and telephone, which means they can continue to support the children, the young people, the families that need their help so keenly. And it is volunteer mentors who have also been trained in the tools needed to support young people online. They've taken this opportunity, more through necessity than anything else, to establish a new project called Talk Together, and this was in response to a serious spike in referrals that began to appear in March. And Talk Together provides a spectrum of support from early help to complex needs via online therapy. So, I mean, think of the pre-existing issues and then think of them being magnified or intensified by the pandemic and lockdown. In areas like anxiety and depression, you don't need me to explain the exacerbating effect that the lockdown could have had. For others, there will be new problems emerging, and that's why the demand for Kids Inspire's services has soared. Over 500 new inquiries for support and an additional 175 individuals receiving their help since this started. By the end of March, the charity was delivering an average of 290 online support sessions per week, and this average is already up to 400. I'd like to introduce you, if I may, to Chloe, who is 13 years old, and, well, I won't tell you too much about her because she can tell you herself, but you were referred, I think, Chloe, to Kids Inspire by your school about 3 years ago. Can you remember why?
Well, at the time, I was going through some confidence issues, and I'm also a young carer because my twin brothers have a disability, which can be quite stressful at times, but Kids Inspire have really helped me cope with that.
So what talk us through the first kind of contacts that you had with them. And it's a long time since I was 10, but I've got children at home, and sometimes they're a little bit surprised to even discover that they needed help. I don't know if that describes you, but what were your early interactions with Kids Inspire all about?
So when I was initially referred to Kids Inspire, I was given counselling, and then I was then given a mentor.
And they help you with the issues that you're struggling with. How valuable was that one-to-one contact, do you think?
it's really helped me become more confident and have a more positive mindset, and it's just really helped me because I've just been really anxious in some situations, and now I feel more confident in them.
So what do they do? Do they give you little tools to use or tactics that you can employ when you feel the anxiety's creeping up on you?
They can give you some coping strategies, like to help with your breathing, to just taking deep breaths. So they're really helpful with that.
And what has the lockdown been like, particularly with reference perhaps to the twins as well? Because, you know, that must have added to the burdens of care that you and the rest of the family have with them. But also, how have you been getting on with the lockdown?
Yeah, it's been quite hard because I miss going out and I really miss my friends, and it's been hard dealing with the boys because sometimes that can be a bit stressful.
I'm sure.
I always know that I have Kids Inspire, my mentor, whenever I need to talk to them. And with my weekly Zoom meetings I do with my mentor.
Yes.
And I know I can talk to her about anything during those.
That's special, isn't it? I think she's called Jane, isn't she, your mentor?
Yeah,
and I hope you don't mind this question, but how do you think you would have got on over the last few weeks if you didn't have Jane in your life?
Well, I just would have been a lot more stressed because during this she's just given me more coping strategies to help deal with it and to keep it under control. And it's really helped me not think so negatively.
I'm so glad to hear that, and you're doing a cracking job of explaining to people listening why it's so important that Kids Inspire is out there helping people like you. What I mean, tell me briefly, when you sort of get to the end of a day at the moment and you've had to deal with the twins a bit and you've probably done a bit of remote learning and you've had a few moments where you felt the stress is rising and you've deployed your tactics and your breathing techniques and some of the skills that Jane has helped you learn. How are you feeling at the moment when you get to the end of a long day in lockdown?
I can always feel quite tired because it's a lot to deal with. But I've gotten used to it. It was quite hard at the start, particularly because I've never experienced anything like this before. But over a couple of months, Jane's helped me get used to it, and she's really helped me with dealing with the stress.
And I suppose, finally, because I'm sure you've got more exciting things to do than talk to an old geezer on the radio at the moment, but finally, how do you think you getting help from Kids Inspire has helped the rest of the family, if you see what I mean?
Well, sometimes I felt like I couldn't really talk to my family, and if I did, then it would just, they would always be thinking about me, and they've got other things to think about. So Kids Inspire have helped me have someone else to talk to, and I don't have to rely on my parents for everything. And
that must help them a bit as well.
Yeah, especially with the boys, because they're quite focused on them, but I know I've always got them to talk to.
Of course, but sometimes it's almost like a question of finding the space and the time, and Kids Inspire gives you a bit of space and time in your head as well as in your life that you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. Am I right?
Yes, definitely.
That's beautifully put. Do you want to do the bit for me? Do you want to say text LBC20 to 70766? Because I don't know if they'll listen to me as much as they'll listen to you, Chloe.
Text LBC
20 to 70766.
To 70706.
66. You're brilliant at this. Do you want to do my holiday cover next Christmas?
Definitely, yeah.
You look after yourself, Chloe. Love to the boys and to Mum and Dad as well. I shall just reiterate what Chloe told us a moment ago. We really do need your help. You can see why this work is so important. You can hear the difference that it makes to young lives. And, you know, I didn't know prior to that conversation that Chloe shoulders some of the burden of care for her brothers. These are children who just need a break. They don't know asking for much. Just a break, and that 20 quid you send to us can help thousands and thousands of them up and down the UK. I'd really stress that. So just text LBC20, that's LBC, followed by the number 20, no spaces, and send it to 70766. LBC20 to 70766, and 100% of your donation, I promise, will go to Global's Make Some Noise. Thank you.